I've worked with a lot of different programmers in my career so far. Some programmers I've worked with have been super productive. Other programmers, although they're just as smart, they're not nearly as productive. And it made me ask, why is that? Why are some programmers super productive and others aren't nearly so? And the answer that I've been able to come up with to that question is the topic of my talk today. First, I'm going to talk about the consequences of coding with a disorganized mind, contrasted with the benefits of coding with an organized mind. And then I'm going to discuss kind of 3 phases of organizing your work. The first is defining your work, breaking a project into small, discrete tasks. The next is setting up your work, mainly using to-do lists and stuff like that. And then lastly, after you've defined your work and set it up, how do you actually carry out your work? First, a little bit about me. My name is Jason Swett. I'm a consultant, and I've been working with Rails for about 8 years now. I host a podcast called the Ruby Testing Podcast, and another one that's coming out soon called Rails with Jason. And I wrote a book called Rails Testing for Beginners. And all my stuff is at codewithjason.com, which is mostly focused around Rails testing. Okay, so organized versus disorganized. When you're disorganized, basically everything sucks. Things are chaotic. You aren't achieving things in a reasonable period of time. Things are stressful, and you'll probably experience something called psychic entropy, which I learned about from the book Flow by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. Basically, it's like, if you've ever tried to read a book and watch a TV show at the same time, you're not really watching the show and not reading the book. It's that state of mind where you're just jumbled. And I find that a lot of programmers are in that state of mind a lot of the time, where they're just kind of jumbled and not focused on any one particular thing. The opposite of that, of course, is that you have order. You're successful. You sit down to build a feature, and you don't have to go down all these different dead-end paths to finish it. You just sit down and do it. And you're in a flow state, which again is from that book Flow, which is a state of enjoyment. You kind of forget about the passage of time. You're in the zone, and you just get your work done. My clicker has stopped working. So has the right arrow on my computer. Okay, problem was apparently with the computer itself. Okay, so how do we take a project and break it down into discrete tasks? I'm going to talk about 2 things: breaking a project into user stories, and then breaking those stories down into tasks, mostly the user stories part. There's a really common problem with designs that you get as a programmer, which is that the designs don't make sense when you get them. Has anybody experienced this? They're like, hey, build this. And it's like, well, I can't build this. It doesn't make sense. So at the risk of stating the obvious, and I think I'll use that phrase a lot in this talk, because a lot of this is stuff that a lot of people might consider common sense, but the designs have to make sense before you can start the work or even start estimation. But how do you make sure that the designs make sense? There's a methodology that I've been using for several years now, and it's pretty much guaranteed to work. And it's known as usability testing. Has anybody here done usability testing in the past? So the great thing about usability testing is it forces your designs to make sense. Because when you go through the process of usability testing, it leaves design defects no place to hide. So the way that it works is that, at least the way that I've done it, is I'll draw out designs on a piece of paper, just pen and paper prototypes, and I'll sit down with somebody who's representative of the end user who's going to be using the program. And I won't ask the person, what do you think of these designs? Because if you ask somebody what they think of the designs, they'll say, oh, it's good. But really, then you try to use it and everything falls apart. So what you do is you lay out a series of tasks, jobs that you need to do using this design, and you say, here's the design, try to use this design to do what you need to do. And I'll give the person a pen, they can fill out forms with the pen, click on stuff with the pen, and I'll act as the browser. They'll pass me the sheet when they submit it, and I'll pass them the subsequent page. And it works because it's a pretty realistic simulation of actually using the software. But of course, you haven't yet gone through all the time and expense of actually building it. And what I've found, and this is really, really interesting, I've found that every single time I've done usability testing, on the first round, I've discovered that my design is way off. And that's with my designs. And I consider myself a pretty good UI designer, although not graphic designer, but pretty good UI designer. And my designs are always way off on the first try. So that's probably true of everybody, even a lot of professional designers. So we discover in those first rounds that the design is way off, go back, rework it, bring it back, do another round of usability testing. Do that a few times, and usually it takes 2 or 3 rounds, and then you finally have something that makes sense and you can implement it. That has a couple really nice benefits. One is that A, you know that it makes sense, but B, everybody who's been involved in that process so far, they know exactly what's being built, so nobody's going to be surprised. Have you ever gone off to build something and came back and said, hey, I'm done, isn't this great? And the person is like, this isn't what I thought we were building. So this completely eliminates that possibility. And one of the best parts is it removes fuel for bike shedding. So we've all experienced this, where people are looking at the designs and saying, I think the field should be like this. No, I think the field should be this way instead. And there's no way to tell whether one person's right or the other person's right. Well, usability testing takes out most of those conversations, because no longer are you just sitting there arguing about what's better. You've tested it, so you know what's better. Here's a couple example usability testing scenarios. Let's say that I'm building an appointment scheduling system. Winston Yapple's Apple calls to schedule an appointment for 2 p.m. on Monday, add the appointment to the calendar. So that's what the subject would have to try to use the software to do. If they get stuck, you don't give them any hints or anything like that. If the person gets stuck, that's a sign there's a design defect. The design isn't easy enough to understand, and the design needs to be reworked. So then once you've gone through that process, maybe you've done that with several screens in the project that you're building, each one of those scenarios can be translated into a user story. And I assume a lot of people in the room are familiar with agile methodologies and terminology, but just in case anybody's not, when I say user story, I just mean one, what you might call a ticket, whatever would be your issue and your issue tracker. Attributes of a good story, and this is another case of being at the risk of stating the obvious, but I've seen a lot of stories that violate all these principles. A story should have a clear and descriptive title. So like, ability to schedule appointment is a good title, Something like appointments is a bad title. But you see that a lot, just like a one-word user story title. That's not good. It should be clear. It should be obvious what it means for the story to be complete. So if there's somebody looking at this story for the first time without any context, they should be able to read the description of the story and have a pretty good idea of, like, if I'm the QA person QAing this to see if is this done or not done, I can just read what's here and tell whether it's done or not. There's kind of two parts to that. One is the particular story, and the other is, for any story that you work on, what does it mean for it to be done? So is it done when it's code complete? Is it done when it's QA'd and deployed to production and verified in production, or somewhere in between? That should be decided for all the stories that you ever do, and then also individually for each story. Stories also shouldn't each shouldn't be more than a few days of work. The reason I think that is because, well, if you've ever experienced the alternative, a story that's supposed to last like a week, and then it drags on for like 3 weeks, that's a pretty big deal, and it happens more than you might think. And then by the time you're finally done with it, it's like a super long time later. But if a story is only supposed to take a day, and it takes 3 days, that's not such a big of a deal. Okay, so that's defining the work, saying what are we going to do. Now let's talk about setting up the work. Now that we know what we're going to do, let's line it up for execution. So again, at the risk of stating the obvious, I'm going to talk about to-do lists. What's the purpose of a to-do list? For me, the purpose of a to-do list is to always know, with zero ambiguity, what am I trying to accomplish right now? That's actually what inspired me to give this whole talk, is working with programmers, pairing with colleagues, and realizing that if I asked them the question right now, what are you trying to accomplish? I don't think they'd be able to answer that question. So we should always have an answer to the question, what exactly am I trying to accomplish right now? So my to-do list items come from the user stories in my projects. So hopefully, hopefully I'm working somewhere where we work in sprints of 1 or 2 weeks, and at the beginning of those sprints, we each tackle a number of user stories. We each pick a handful of user stories to commit to for that sprint. And then each day, I'll look at my user stories that I've committed to for that sprint, and that'll be the start of my to-do list. That's the main place where my to-do items come from, but there's a little more to it than that for me. So when I'm generating my to-do list for a particular day, I'll start at the very highest level. And this might sound silly, but I'll really start at the highest level. What do I want to accomplish in my whole life? And then what do I want to accomplish this year, this month, etc. Because it's really, really easy to just do your day-to-day work, and then you find yourself 35 years old or whatever, and it's like, wait a second, I wanted to do all this stuff with my life, but I didn't, and now I'm like old. So I think that's a good thing to keep in mind every day. And I actually have a list of things on the wall, things I want to accomplish in 2019, and I really do make my to-do list match those things. I also go from coarse grain to fine grain. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So here's how we go from coarse grain to fine grain. So a user story is usually too broad to really be tractable and to actually start working on it. Like if we have a user story of adding an ability to schedule an appointment, that's actually, even though it's pretty crisp, it's not small enough to work on. So I'll think about it this way. My big picture goal is to get this appointment system working. That's kind of the project level goal. Then I'll go down one level from that, and I want to add the ability to schedule an appointment. One level down from that, I want to add the ability to add a patient to an appointment. because it's a little bit too hard to think about, like, okay, adding the ability to schedule an appointment, what does that mean? I have to start somewhere. So I'll say, okay, I want to add a patient to the appointment. But even that is too broad, because it's like, okay, I want to add a patient to an appointment, but how does that work? Like UI-wise, how does a patient get added to the appointment? Now I have to think about, like, do I start with the view code or the controller code or the model? Where do I start? So I'll go even finer grain and say, I just want to get a patient field to show up on the appointment screen. I'm not worried about getting anything persisted to the database or anything like that. I just literally want the field on the page. It doesn't even have to have the right ID or anything like that. I just need to be able to see it with my eyes. And then once I have that in place, I'll create several other to-do lists at a similar granularity. So I start my day with a draft to-do list that looks kind of like this. I always have 2 sections to each day's to-do list, a personal section and a work section. So in a particular day, I might work on my RailsConf talk, get an oil change for my van, order spatulas on Amazon. And then for work, I'll start my day with just a couple goals. So I want to add the ability to save an appointment and cancel an existing appointment. I know that I'll work on more stuff in that day, but this is enough to get me started. And that's really the job of this draft to-do list, is just to get me started on my day. What I don't want to do is sit down and be like, okay, what do I want to work on? And then like randomly grab some stuff, and then like 2 hours later, I'm kind of halfway done with multiple things. That's bad. So if I can just sit down and immediately start being productive, that's really good. And by the way, different people work differently, but I think this is true of probably more than half of people, which is starting in the morning really makes for it makes the whole day much more productive if you get an early start in the morning and just hit the ground running with getting some actual work done. There's this term, they call it the rudder of the day. So many people have found this phenomenon to be true, that they call that first hour of the day the rudder of the day. If you start off productively, then the rest of the day will be productive. If you start off the day in a state of psychic entropy, checking Twitter and Facebook and all that stuff, and email, and it makes your mind jumbled, and it lasts for like the whole rest of the day. I don't know why that is, but it's definitely the case for, I think, probably most people. Okay, and then I'll maintain my to-do list throughout the day. And the main thing that I want to emphasize here is that I'll take each of my to-do items and I'll expand it. Because again, like when we were talking about the coarse-grained versus fine-grained to-dos, ability to save an appointment is too coarse-grained. So I'll keep a list of things that I want to do. In this particular case, I'll like list out all the tests that I want to write for this feature. So I'll be doing that all day. I'll start with coarse-grained list items and then expand them into fine-grained ones. Okay, so now that we've defined our work and we've set up our work in the form of to-do lists, how do we carry out our work in a way that's fast and efficient? I'm going to touch on 4 points: focused work sessions, atomic commits, small short-lived branches, and small frequent deployments. So focused work sessions, I'm a big fan of closing email and closing Slack while I'm working. And I don't close email and Slack for like the whole entire day, but I'll maybe close email and Slack for an hour, and then like, let's say I start at 8 a.m., at 9 o'clock a.m., I'll give myself permission to like have a treat and open up my email and Slack and check all my messages and stuff. It's kind of more fun that way because like then you get it all at once rather than being peppered with messages all throughout your workday and being distracted. So I don't like disappear for a whole day or anything like that. I'll pop up about once an hour and give myself like 2 or 3 minutes of checking email and Slack. And doing that, it helps emphasize like just how not important most of these messages are that you get through these channels. And then Twitter and Facebook, like I've worked with people who have Twitter notifications popping up in their upper right-hand corner. That's just insane. Those have no value, and they just distract you, and it's madness. So don't do that. And preferably don't have that stuff on your phone either. Like I don't have those apps on my phone at all. And now that it's been well over a year since I've had Twitter or Facebook on my phone, and I look back and it's like, why did I ever have that stuff on my phone? It adds no enjoyment to a person's life at all. My life is not any worse. It's better since I deleted those things off my phone. That's kind of a separate topic though. But I guess the point is that Twitter and Facebook are poisonous and stay away from them as much as possible. So in addition to those things, clearly state your current goal and your related tasks using those nested levels of granularity that I described earlier. Atomic commits. So something that really frustrates me and is counterproductive is when you have commits that are several different pieces of work, some of which are in a partial state of completeness. It makes everything hard, and maybe the easiest way to explain why it makes everything hard is to explain how it's better when you don't do that. So each commit should just be one single piece of work. And I like that because everybody makes mistakes. I make mistakes. And when I make my commits small and they're just one single thing, it's so much easier to roll back something. Like if you've ever had the experience where you commit something and it's like this big chunk of work and then this little part of it that's mixed in that ends up like introducing a bug or something like that. You want to roll back the bug, but now you have to roll back this whole piece of work because it contains a bug in an unrelated piece of work. So that sucks to have to do that. It's better just to have each commit be an individual piece of work. If you have a commit that introduces a bug and you need to roll it back, then you can only roll back that one commit, and it's much tidier to fix it. And just to give you a feel for the size of my commits, I tend to commit every 5 to 15 minutes. And part of what that allows me to do is clear my mind. Once I commit something, I'm free to no longer think about that thing because it's on the books, it's done, I can just forget about it. The other place this is helpful is when I'm doing git bisect to try to find the place that a bug got introduced. Small atomic commits make bisecting a lot easier. And if you're not a big git bisector, as a side note, I highly recommend git bisect. Okay, small short-lived branches. Has anybody ever worked on a feature where the branch lasted like weeks or maybe even months? Whoa, I didn't expect that many people. That's horrific. Okay, I have too. So that's risky. When you have a branch that lives for a long time, it's diverging every day that you work on it. It's diverging from the master branch. That makes it so when you integrate the two, it's more risky. It increases the chances that when you try to integrate the two, you're going to have some conflicts. So that's bad. And the more branches you have, and the longer they live, the more confusion and overhead it costs. Like I can think of projects I've worked on in the past where at any given time we have like dozens of branches going at the same time. And it's like you forget about what was this branch for again? Is this work still important? Do we need this? It's much more difficult to manage, much more time consuming to manage than when you just have master, branch off a master, merge back in, branch off a master, merge back in. And those branches only live for like a day or less than a day or a couple days at the very most. A common objection to having branches that only last like a day or two is that like, well, we're working on this feature. We can't release this feature in a state of partial completeness. This feature has to be done before we can release it. So we can't have a branch that only lasts a couple days. So the way people tend to address that is using feature flags. The idea behind that is that you're separating the idea of deployment from the idea of release. So with a feature flag, I might have, let's say I have a user profile page and I'm adding a bunch of new fields to it and I don't want to release it until I have all this new functionality. I'll put that behind a feature flag so it's invisible when the feature flag is turned off. That way we can still deploy that code in a state of partial completeness, still have branches that only live for a short period of time, and still have user stories that are very small, and I tend to have each branch corresponding to just one single user story. And then when it's finally done, even though you've been deploying it the whole time, you can turn your feature flag on, and that feature will appear. It also makes it easier to roll back features. If you roll out a feature and it has like an unforeseen negative consequence for some reason, you just turn that feature back off. And Git flow is horrible. Because of those reasons I listed earlier, Git flow involves like all these different branches, so there's so much more overhead to managing all of that. My preferred way of working is, like I kind of mentioned earlier, you just have master, branch off of master for each story, and then merge right back into master. Small frequent deployments are advantageous for the same reason that small frequent commits are advantageous, and that has to do with the divergence. Maybe you've experienced the scenario where you do a big deployment and the deployment causes problems, and there's a lot of firefighting and damage control that has to happen after the deployment, and so leadership says, okay, that was a terrible experience, let's deploy not as frequently anymore. And so then you deploy less frequently, and so your deployments are even bigger, and so even more things go wrong each time you deploy. That's bad, of course, so the way to take care of, the way to not have those issues is deploy as frequently as you can, because then each of your deployments will be as small as possible. There's less stuff to go wrong each time. That ties into the concept of dev-prod parity. It's helpful to keep your development environment and your production environment in as close of a state as possible at all times, because we've all dealt with those bugs that only appear in production, which are really hard to troubleshoot. So if you always keep production and development as close as possible, it reduces the likelihood that those scenarios arise. And that means both in terms of like infrastructure and the code that's living in those environments. So these are the takeaways that I'd like you to take away from this talk. First is, in the beginning, when you're defining your work, iron out the flaws in designs by using usability testing, because again, that will force your designs to make sense. It'll leave the defects no place to hide. And make sure that every story is crisply defined. Again, it should have a clear, easily understandable title. By reading the body of the user story, you should be able to tell exactly what it means for that story to be complete. Write down everything you're going to do and always be able to answer the question, what exactly am I trying to accomplish right now? And work in small units using atomic commits and frequent integrations and frequent deployments. Okay, so if you want to learn more about this stuff and the other Rails topics that I write about, you can go to codewithjason.com, or you can email me at jason@codewithjason.com. And if you have questions afterward, I'm not going to do Q&A up here, but I'm going to hang around in this room after, and so if anybody wants to come up and talk about this stuff, I'd be happy to answer any questions that way. Thank you.